If you couldn't already guess from my background, I'm a big fan of history and geography. I've probably been studying ever since I was a little kid. And this means whenever some big world news event happens, my family comes to me for advice. And recently, that happened when the invasion of Ukraine took place. When the war broke out, my family was looking at a lot of maps of both Ukraine and Russia, and they saw this little strip of land between Poland and Lithuania. And then they saw it was owned by Russia. This is the Oblast of Kaliningrad, an exclave of the Russian Federation. It used to be the German city of Königsberg before it was annexed by the Soviet Union and renamed during World War II. My family members asked me why Russia owned it. If the city's German, why didn't Germany control it? If it's near Poland and Lithuania, why didn't they just annex it? And that's where the alternate history scenario started playing out in my mind. I mean, why not make an alternate history video? My art was in an alternate history hub video, so hey, maybe I'm suited for it. See, this tiny piece of land has a big historical importance. The butterfly effect is pretty strong here because of that. And there are multiple options on what could have happened. So in this video, I'll present 3 different alternate history scenarios. The first one where Lithuania annexes Kaliningrad, the second where Poland does so, and finally, what would happen if Kaliningrad was still Königsberg, and still a part of Germany? And then I'll wrap everything up with what effect this would have on Russia. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's start with some historical context. Back when Kaliningrad was known as Königsberg, it served as the capital city to a vassal state of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth named Prussia. Upon Prussia's independence, it formed a union with a neighboring German state named Brandenburg and entered the politics of the Holy Roman Empire, a supranational union of Central European states. And through a long series of wars, consolidations, and concessions, Brandenburg Prussia was able to become the dominant member amongst the states of the Holy Roman Empire, and eventually unified the region into becoming the German Empire. Skipping ahead, the German Empire would famously lose World War I and get partitioned into becoming the Weimar Republic. This is important because this is the first time in history Königsberg was an exclave. This province would be known as East Prussia. Skipping ahead some more, the Weimar Republic eventually fell to the National Socialist Party and became the Third Reich. And then the Third Reich would go on to lose World War II. And once again, East Prussia was partitioned into the modern-day borders of the Kaliningrad Oblast. And underneath the occupation of the Soviet Union, the ethnic German population that made up Königsberg was completely scourged and replaced with ethnic Russians. You know, it's just the Soviet Union being the Soviet Union. But eventually, the Soviet Union did collapse, and when it did, the Russian Federation took Kaliningrad with it. Not that that wasn't always the plan. Nikita Khrushchev did actually offer the Lithuanian government the ability to annex it. However, the Lithuanian government did end up declining this offer because they were afraid with how many ethnic Russians were imported into Kaliningrad over the years, that annexing the territory would cause a race war. And they were probably right. But that leads perfectly into our first alternate history scenario. What would have happened if Lithuania annexed Kaliningrad? Lithuania actively refused the offer to annex Kaliningrad, and in this segment I'm going to talk about why that was absolutely the right choice. See, when Lithuania was offered the ability to annex Kaliningrad, it was already after the Russification of the area. The dominant population in the area was already Russian. This means Lithuania would have a large, condensed Russian minority. Now, Lithuania already does have a Russian minority, but they only make up around 5% of the population and are spread basically evenly across the country. Kaliningrad would not only bump that number up to 10 to 15%, but would also give the Russian communities in Lithuania an organized voting bloc. Due to the size of Lithuanian counties, Kaliningrad would probably be divided up into 3 or 4 individual counties within Lithuania. This would only multiply the amount of voting power Russian Lithuanians had within the state. Now, that doesn't mean Russian Lithuanians would automatically be loyal to the Russian Federation, but at the same time, the Russian Federation is known for funding separatist movements in ethnically similar areas, so keep that in mind. Realistically, this could lead to 3 different outcomes. The first one is Kaliningrad and its associated counties would become the equivalent of Quebec within Lithuania. What I mean by that is, Kaliningrad is still a part of Lithuania. They don't try to be a separatist movement or anything, but they act as an obstructionist bloc that stagnates Lithuania slowly. They're never an outright political issue on the level of a militant threat, but they're just a bureaucratic nuisance. The second outcome is that eventually, voters within Kaliningrad vote to rejoin the Russian Federation. This would essentially just reconverge this alternate timeline into our own. And this third outcome? Well, I want to stress that this is a worst case scenario. This third outcome, Lithuania becomes the next Belarus. Either by direct intervention by the Russian Federation, or a Lukashenko-esque figure within Lithuanian politics arising. It's possible that the same type of revanchist socialism could encapsulate Lithuania, creating a nation very similar to Belarus. Immediately, this would result in Poland, Latvia, and Sweden having to take in a lot of refugees, the remaining Lithuanian nationals staying to resist the oppression. But what happens after that? Does Lithuania join the CSTO and become a Russian bloc state? Does this put a literal fork between NATO's Nordic and Central European members? Not implausible, but I'm gonna say no. Lithuanians would still be the majority in Lithuania, and it's very unlikely that this SSR-style puppet government would be very popular within the citizens who just escaped Soviet oppression. This new puppet government probably wouldn't have a whole lot of longevity. It would probably only collapse after a few years of being propped up, either by a resistance within Lithuania or, well, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I think it's in NATO's best interest to overthrow this hypothetical Lithuanian SSR. But in the end, any scenario where Lithuania annexes Kaliningrad ends badly for them. It's a good thing they never did that. Good on them for turning down the offer. But Poland, they never got offered Kaliningrad. So this next scenario is going to be completely hypothetical. As far as I was able to research, Poland was never offered the ability to annex Kaliningrad like Lithuania was. In fact, I found quite the contrary. In 1957, there was a piece of legislation drafted between the Soviet Union and the Polish People's Republic, Poland back when it was a Soviet satellite, and this piece of legislation prevented Poland from annexing the lands. So for this scenario, we're gonna have to go back in time a little bit further. Some real-world history I skipped over the first time because it wasn't as relevant. In 1945, after World War II, the Potsdam Agreement was put into effect. It had a lot of effects on Europe, but the one we care about the most is the fact that it allowed Poland to annex these lands from Germany and expel anyone living there. So for this scenario, let's say that after World War II, Poland is just allowed to partition more of East Prussia than they did in our timeline. The justification doesn't really matter. Maybe it's something Britain and France forced them to do, like they did with Denmark and Schleswig-Holstein after World War I. But now that Poland has ownership over Kaliningrad, or well, Königsberg, since this is pre-Russification, what do they do with it? Well, it's a minor thing, but the first thing they would do is they'd rename the town. They had a tradition of renaming a lot of the German cities that they annexed, so Königsberg would be renamed to Krolwijk. And from this point onward, it's going to take a long time before the full effects of annexing Krolwijk actually affect the nation, probably only until after the 1970s when the Communist Party falls. Prussia may have abandoned Königsberg as its capital after forming the German Empire, but Königsberg remained as the capital of German imperial might, and to German nationalists, it will always have an important place in their heart. The fact that this city fell into the hands of Poland in this timeline would anger them immensely. Because remember, the ideology of the National Socialist Party was that the Polish people as a race weren't their own people with thoughts and feelings. They were just some obstructionist force meant to postpone their rightful rule over Europe. It's stupid and selfish, but, you know. This anger and hatred towards people could be taken advantage of by a surreptitious organization. A surreptitious organization like, say, the Identitarians. They're this pan-European political party that heavily borrows ideas from the National Socialist Party in Germany. And I only bring them up because they've been known to spark protests in previously German areas of Poland before. And in this timeline, it's very likely that they try and plant their base of operations in Krolwijk, which they'd insist on calling Königsberg, due to its symbolic importance to German nationalists. This would be a nuisance for both the Polish people now living in Krolwijk, but also the remaining Germans living there, since they'd assumed that the Germans living in Krolwijk that aren't actively protesting Polish rule are just docile. I really did not want to get political in this video, but primarily the effects this would have on Poland in this timeline would solely be political, so it's really unavoidable. And besides, as a centrist, if I condemn communism in a video, I also have to condemn fascism too. Tangent aside, I really think the only other notable things this would change is, well, what effects it would have on Russia, which we'll talk about later, and the effect this would have on Polish-German relations. The modern-day relations between Germany and Poland are good, but there are still a couple hiccups between them. And the fact that a violent alt-right extremist organization is occupying one of their cities proclaiming German nationalism would not help that. Of course, Germany has and will continue to condemn the Identitarians, but it'll just be one more notch just pushing apart these otherwise amazing allies. The effects Krolwijk had on Poland in this timeline are a lot less severe than it did on Kaliningrad in Lithuania's timeline because, well, Lithuania is just a smaller country. Poland is so large that even if Kaliningrad did affect Poland's election or parliament, the effects would be so small they'd be insignificant. But I promise that is not the case with Germany. So let's rip the band-aid off and just get to them. With Lithuania and Poland scenarios, we discussed the tensions between different ethnicities. However, in Germany, that's not going to be the case. Because the only point in history Germany could have ever taken back Königsberg was during the West-East German divide. It's very unlikely, but in this scenario, let's just say the Soviet Union gives Königsberg to East Germany. Maybe we could justify it by saying that the Soviet Union did it to legitimize the East German state as the one true German state. Not that it would work, just that they did it for that reason. Anyways, in this timeline, Königsberg starts as part of East Germany before being reincorporated into the United Federal Republic of Germany. But, important side note, Königsberg would likely suffer under the same Soviet oppression that the rest of East Germany did. And that'll be important for later. In 1989, East Germany would rejoin West Germany, and along with it, Königsberg. And just 1 year later, an election would be held. And this is important because Germany is a federal democracy, meaning the turnover of its elections is based on the proportional representation system based on its states. And now they have a new state. Yeah, that certainly throws a fastball into their bureaucracy.
It's even official size! But not official weight!
Now, what effect Königsberg has on the German voting system depends on what Königsberg voters are like. And since the native population in modern-day Kaliningrad isn't German, and their votes don't really matter, I'll have to start making assumptions. Based on the history they would have gone through, I'm gonna assume that older Königsbergers who lived through the Soviet oppression would be isolationist, disillusioned atheists who see politics as this pedantic means to an end. Which I'm basing off the population of East Germany, mostly. On the contrary, younger Königsbergers would naturally be rebellious against this attitude, and take a more national pride in being the old Prussian capital. They'd be proud of their old Königsberger traditions, which would be stuff like marzipan, the thespian arts, and even the writings of Immanuel Kant. They might even have some overlap with the Polish-style charismatic Christianity that got them through their communist regime. After all, Königsberg is geographically closer to Warsaw than Berlin, so taking some concepts from Poland wouldn't be too out of left field. Since the German voting age is 18, the youth vote would probably be the most prominent, especially since the Königsberger boomers would probably be too apathetic to vote. And with that in mind, I believe that Königsberg would most consistently vote for the Christian Democrat Union, aka the CDU. Hell, they might even have their own regional variant to the CDU, like Bavaria. Now, to Germans, that wouldn't sound too disruptive, since by the time East Germany was annexed, the CDU had a non-contiguous 30-year reign over the country. However, there being extra voters in the CDU at this specific point in German history is important. 1998 saw the election that ousted then-Chancellor Helmut Kohl and replaced him with Gerhard Schröder. However, Schröder only won by the slimmest of margins. If Königsberg is a consistent CDU voting state, then Kohl might get re-elected. Now, obviously, I have no way of knowing how many people would live in this hypothetical Königsberg for a voting bloc. But let's just say for this scenario that it's enough to get Kohl re-elected, because that's more interesting. If you aren't aware, Helmut Kohl was the chancellor who oversaw German reunification and the creation of the European Union. He had the longest tenure of a chancellor since Otto von Bismarck, and he was a strong Reagan ally in the Cold War. Now, that's probably how his supporters would like him to be remembered as. But sadly, there is one part of his history I didn't mention. Near the end of his life, Helmut Kohl was also involved in a tax fraud scandal relating to party donations during his tenure as chancellor. He kept a lot of the party donors anonymous, which, if you didn't know, that's illegal under German law. Now, in our timeline, this scandal only happened after he left office. But if he got re-elected, this issue would arise during his tenure as chancellor, potentially leading to his impeachment in office. Or if he tried to cover it up, it would be a German version of Watergate. Since a German vote of no confidence only requires a majority in the Bundestag for a forced resignation, it's very likely Kohl could get impeached. Especially since by this point the CDU was slowly becoming less and less popular in mainland Germany. This would obviously affect Kohl's image as a politician in the minds of the public. Instead of him being remembered as a mostly great statesman with just this small hiccup near the end of his career, he'd instead be remembered the same way Nixon is in the United States, a national embarrassment. This would permanently damage the reputation of the CDU in German politics. And that's a big deal when you realize Angela Merkel was also a CDU chancellor. However, I think at this point, this timeline's version of German politics is so radically different from our own that the consequences would be basically unpredictable. So I'll just stop there. Well, at least on their domestic issues. I haven't talked about their foreign policy yet. Königsberg being German in this timeline might not seem like it has any effects on other nations, but there's one specific nation that might cause conflict over it. Of course, I'm talking about Poland, again. You see, in the modern age, nations don't just have land borders. They also have maritime borders, aka Economic Exclusivity Zones, or EEZ for short. And because of this fun fact, well, Germany and Poland have a border conflict now. You history buffs in the back of me remember that those don't usually end well. I mean, how should Germany's maritime borders look? Should they connect like this? Well, that blocks off Poland from the rest of Europe. Should they copy how they look in our timeline with Russia's EEZ? Well then, how do ships from Königsberg go to mainland Germany and vice versa without entering Polish waters? And how does Lithuania factor into this? Well, thankfully, there's an organization that can help solve a dispute like this. The European Union. As I said earlier, Germany was one of the key members in the construction of the European Union. After reunification, it poised itself as a strong economic powerhouse that could help smaller nations like Latvia and Bulgaria, whilst also being a good diplomatic ally to fellow global superpowers like Britain and France. So Germany of all nations would know that the best way to solve this maritime squabble is with the European Union. In this timeline, Germany, Poland, and potentially Lithuania too, would agree to co-join their maritime waters in the Baltic Sea, underneath an EU-controlled zone. I mean, it's the best way to prevent a Cod War-esque conflict between the three. A new council of the European Union would be created to dictate how this maritime bloc would function. Let's call them the South Baltic Boundary Commission of the European Union. That sounds just boring enough to be a real EU organization. This organization would be comprised of fishermen, shipping company planners, economists, and lawyers from Germany, Poland, and Lithuania, and would be responsible for deciding how the legislation of this co-owned maritime boundary works. Germany would do this basically as a way to signal to the rest of Europe, hey, we can solve problems without having to go to war now. This whole European Union thing might be a good idea. Maybe you should join it. Poland and Lithuania would obviously love this arrangement since it all but doubles the size of their maritime waters. And I already mentioned how the German government would like it because it allows them to provide a good use case for the European Union. But it also might anger German nationalists. They'd probably decry this as globalism, and that Germany cares more about international politics than providing for their own actual citizens. Not that that's actually the case. But regardless of that, this event could have cascading effects on how we view the concept of territorial waters. Imagine if Greece and Turkey's disputes over the Aegean Sea Islands was resolved with a situation like this. Obviously, Turkey would have to get admitted into the EU a lot quicker for that to work. But beyond Europe, imagine what the South China Sea conflict would look like with this kind of precedent, that multiple nations can share territorial waters. But let's not get too off topic. So, we've talked about what would happen if the Russian Oblast of Kaliningrad was owned by other countries, but I think it's about time we actually take into account what effect this would have on, you know, Russia, the country that actually owns Kaliningrad in our timeline. Now, in this alternate timeline, it doesn't matter who owns Kaliningrad. As long as it's not Russia, it would basically have the same effect. But what would that effect be? Well, that hinges on one specific thing. The Nord Stream oil pipeline. See, Nord Stream is an oil pipeline that goes from St. Petersburg to Kaliningrad, and then trails off to Germany. Now, I wasn't able to confirm this, but I assume Russia was allowed to build the Nord Stream pipelines because, you know, they owned Kaliningrad. They were allowed to link up their territorial waters. If that's not entirely the case, or they could construct Nord Stream anyway without owning Kaliningrad, then nothing in this timeline changes. Russian history just goes on as normal, exactly the way it does in our timeline. However, if no Kaliningrad means no Nord Stream, then that's where Russia begins to have issues. See, Russia had one thing on its side when reasserting its political dominance after the fall of the Soviet Union. Time. A little bit of real history first. There's this era in Russian history that Russian citizens usually like to call the Patriotskia Pentia era. And that's because Russia briefly changed its national anthem to a song of that name after the Soviet Union's demise. And this decade of Russian history is defined by the country completely slumping economically. And this economic downturn, combined with the fact that they just lost a lot of important territory and global influence, well, Russians felt like their country was dying. The Federation would slowly turn into a corrupt mafia state, with those in positions of power choosing to consolidate as many resources as possible for themselves over helping their citizenry. However, things began to change when a certain man entered the office of president. That being Vladimir Putin. Oh god. Putin, through his dubious tactics, was able to turn Russia into a global oil monopoly, and helped solidify his position as an important world leader. And slowly, Russia would regain a lot of the international leverage it lost when the Soviet Union collapsed, and was able to pressure other nations into fulfilling its best interests. And when they didn't, well, you've seen the headlines. However, Putin was only able to do all this because he was able to export oil to Europe. If the Nord Stream pipeline doesn't exist, there's only one other pipeline Russia has that could import oil into Europe. And, of course, it had to be the one through Ukraine. There is an oil pipeline going through Belarus, too, but whatever Soviet engineer made it was a dumbass and decided to link it back up to Ukraine. So, if Russia wasn't able to export gas without exorbitant tariffs in this timeline, it's very likely they would continue down the path of the corrupt mafia state and never become the hawkish national hegemon it is in our timeline. See, when I said Russia had time on its side when reconstructing its geopolitical dominance, I meant it. One more year and it's very likely things would have never gotten better for Russia. And because Nord Stream doesn't exist, that means they don't have that year. Because of how important oil is to the Russian economy, oil producers would be the richest people in the country and would vicariously have the most amount of power in politics. Slowly, lines between different hegemons of oil moguls would be drawn, and it would only benefit the white-collar bureaucracy to never change. So they wouldn't. Russia would purposely stagnate to keep the people in power in charge. And because Russia didn't act fast to assert power quickly, it means that the South Caspian oil line between Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan gets created. In our timeline, they prevented its creation through peer pressure, alongside Iran. But that never happens in this timeline. And similarly, Ukraine would finally be able to drill its own oil deposits and wouldn't need to rely off of Russia for oil, or even Russia for oil tariffs. In our timeline, Russia was able to scare companies like Exxon into not drilling into Ukraine so they could keep a dominant thumb over Ukraine's oil industry. But much like Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan's oil pipeline, Russia's unable to do that because they simply don't have the geopolitical leverage. Putin would never get elected, because even if his election campaign in our timeline was very, I'll just say democratic in quotation marks, he still wouldn't win. He'd lose a rigged election. Because remember, if it benefits those with money and resources to keep him out of power, he stays out of power. A docile acting president would likely be placed instead of him. One who's disposable and rubber stamps all the changes the white-collar elites would want. Now, I don't want to make it sound like Putin saved Russia or he's a good leader or anything, because the truth is, a collective anonymous of oil moguls would only be a worse leader. That's really not saying much. Anyways, Russian society in this timeline would be dismal. Many would probably leave for work in other countries like Germany, Finland, or Serbia. And externally, the effect this would have on world politics would be immense. Russia would essentially just be gone. Any conflict that Russia had any part in, they just aren't there, because they don't have a strong external leadership. Off the top of my head, that would include the Assads being ousted as the heads of Syria, Azerbaijan taking back Nagorno-Karabakh from Armenia, Chechnya would probably become independent, the Central African Republic would probably hire out China instead of Russia to protect its diamond mines, and Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO and the EU. Hell, maybe Lukashenko never becomes the leader of Belarus and they also become an EU-NATO state. And Trump would still probably get elected though. So, this video certainly covered a heavier subject matter than Five Nights at Freddy's fan art, but I'm glad I made this. I'm a big faux savant when it comes to history, and I hope even if you aren't, I made this video interesting enough that you enjoyed it anyway. I know for certain this video wasn't completely comprehensive over the entire subject, but there were too many loose ends to cover. So if you think there's something important that I missed, please comment down below. Thank you so much for watching.